hope also entertaining and engaging. So once more, welcome. We have a filled crowd. We sold capacity today for this debate, and we have folks watching online as well. This debate would not have been possible if not for the generous support of Young Voices Foundation. Thank you, Young Voices. A little round of applause for Young Voices. And the live stream platform civil.com, a platform that hopes to engage audiences from all across the United States and elsewhere in engaging debates and content that aims to focus on the general idea of civil discourse and freedom. So thank you again for Civil, and to all those watching online on Civil right now. Welcome and thank you. Now, my name, as the excellent video showed, is Hekmat Matthew Abu Khater. I'm a Syrian-American libertarian, and I worked with the United Nations last year, and during that time, I got introduced to the excellent concept of an Oxford-style debate because of a gentleman who is here with us in the crowd who introduced me to the Soho Forum debates. Gene Epstein is sitting right here. Please go ahead, Gene Epstein. Gene Epstein runs the Soho Forum debates, and he just recently concluded his 100th debate. Congratulations, Gene. And he just turned 80 as well.
And Hekmat allowed me to say a few words. I'm very proud of these guys. Hek is my favorite guy from the former country of Syria, and I will be really pissed off if Trump catches up with him. I gather that he's enrolling at Yale in a program, the stupidest thing you can imagine doing, except he thinks this will protect him from getting deported. I keep telling him, you can run, but you can't hide. But let's hope for the best. But I'm running out of time, and I want to use the time just to announce that if you go into thesohoforum.org, first of all, I want to thank the Civil people for streaming our debates, and I also want you to go into thesohoforum.org to recognize and buy tickets to our next 3 debates. We are going up to Concord, Massachusetts to a special libertarian conference end of April to do a debate up there, going out of town, but we're coming back to town in May to do a debate with Dave Smith, especially on immigration. Dave keeps announcing it on his show, so we're about 2/3 sold out. So go on that website if you want to get a ticket to that one. And that's where we hold, when we hold it at the Sheen Center, we do our after parties at my loft apartment catered by my wife, because that's our second mission. And the mission of this, too, to build a community of people, to have romantic connections, career connections, connections of every sort, to get to know each other intellectually and otherwise. That's what our parties are all about, and it's usually about 11 o'clock at night that I tell the young people who stick around, please take it to an all-night bar. And I finally get rid of them. I'm the bouncer. But that's a lot of fun, and in June, we're going to go back in time. Something I grew up with. I turned 80 in November. So as you might imagine, I grew up with the Cold War. We are going to have a debate between 2 scholars on what exactly happened during that half a century that we call, or nearly half a century, that we call the Cold War. The June one will be posted soon. The immigrant debate is posted already, and our April debate is posted as well. So please, thesohoforum.org for our debates. And I look forward with great excitement to this evening's debate hosted by the greatest guy from former country of Syria, Hekmat.
Thank you very much, Gene. I can only vouch for the Soho Forum and the excellent dinners that Hisako, Gene's wife, sets up for us. Please do attend. So speaking of the Soho Forum, this is an Oxford-style debate. Let me just run you through what that looks like. We have 10-minute opening statements from both the debater for the opposition and the proposition. Then we have 5-minute rebuttals, and then we have 40-minute for question and answer from the audience, the debater themselves, and the moderator himself. And then we have 5 minutes for closing remarks. But the twist for this debate is at the beginning, we ask you to vote and make your opinion on this specific resolution known. So please whip out your phone and scan this QR code. You can scan it even if you're from the back, just zoom on your camera, and make your position known on this specific resolution. Do you agree with the following resolution? Trump is making a mistake by trying to force Ukraine into a peace deal with Russia, a country that invaded it unprovoked. On this poll, you get to either agree, disagree, or show that you're undecided on this resolution. And to help you decide, hopefully, we have two excellent debaters. We have fantastic debaters who, between the two of them, I think we have almost 1,000 hours of online content specifically speaking about this specific topic. We have two very well-known journalists here to help us figure out where we stand on this position. So for the proposition, we have Eli Lake. Eli, please come to the stage. Eli is a columnist at the Free Press. Yeah, please. Eli is a columnist for the Free Press, and he runs the podcast called Breaking History, and he is also contributing editor at the Commentary magazine. Thank you, Eli, for participating in this debate. And for the opposition, we have journalists at the Gray Zone and IZ Stone Journalism Award winner, and the IF Stone Journalism Award winner, and the co-host of the Useful Idiots podcast with Katie Halper, Aaron Maté. Aaron, thank you for coming with us. So at this point, I'll get a gauge of the room to see if anyone is still trying to vote. Please make it known. Yeah, it seems like Nick Gillespie is still trying to vote, so we'll give you guys some time. All right, it seems like he voted. All right, excellent. So again, thank you all for being here. Thank you to everyone who's watching on civil.com, on our Civil X platform, and our Civil YouTube. And with that, I will open it up for the opening statement, 10 minutes from Eli Lake. Please take it away, Eli.
Okay. Do I just sit here? Or?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. All right, check. Okay. So thank you so much, Hekmat. And thank you to Young Voices and Civil Forum. It is an honor to be here. So the question before us today is whether it's a mistake for President Trump to force Ukraine into a peace deal. And let me just start off by saying that if there is a chance for real peace, well, how would anybody say no? Because this war has been a horror. The Russians have fired missiles into apartment buildings and hospitals. Russia has forcibly abducted some 20,000 Ukrainian children to territory that it controls, and at least 80,000 lives have perished on the Ukrainian side, and probably, and though there's no precise measure, hundreds of thousands on the Russian side. War is awful. But that said, it's also important to understand a crucial and salient fact. All of this destruction is the fault of one man, Vladimir Putin. He ordered the invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then renewed that invasion again in 2022. His goal is not a peaceful border with Russia's neighbor. His goal is for Ukraine to no longer exist. He has said as much on the eve of this latest war in 2022 when he declared in a rambling and psychotic speech that, quote, modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia. Well, that is one of many lies that Putin tells about Ukraine. He insists that Ukraine's first president is actually a Nazi when this first Jewish president, when Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish. He believes that Ukrainians would have welcomed his brutal army as liberators, and on it goes. So I mention all this because given this recent history, one must ask exactly what kind of peace the Trump administration has in mind when they bully Ukraine's besieged president into signing over half the rights of his country's rare earth minerals in perpetuity. What kind of peace does Donald Trump envision when his senior advisors say openly that Ukraine will never join the defensive NATO alliance or recover the territory that Vladimir Putin's army has stolen? What kind of peace does Trump have in mind when his vice president berates Zelensky before the world? And the answer is that this is not really about peace at all. It is a plan for submission. To stop the war, Ukraine must only surrender. Well, Zelensky doesn't need Trump for that. All he has to do is kneel. Now, perhaps there are people in the audience today who think that Ukrainians are so tired of the war that they would agree to relinquish their nation to the same country that has tried for the last few centuries to end Ukraine altogether, whether it was Stalin's mass starvation campaign in the Holodomor or the Romanov dynasty's efforts to outlaw the Ukrainian language and subjugate the Ukrainians. And of course, submission is a kind of peace, but it is not an enduring one. Now, I want to address the strongest arguments from the other side in my own power. And if it feels threatened, The argument says that it may use its apocalyptic weapons. And there is, of course, always such a risk. But it is a risk the Ukrainian government, which has the most to lose here, has been willing to take. But more important, Putin has shown that he's not a madman. He is a cunning and wicked tyrant, but he isn't crazy. Introducing nuclear weapons into the Ukraine conflict will have enormous consequences, and I do not believe that Putin would risk them. But if it is nuclear war that you fear, if you are worried about nuclear proliferation, I would only point you to recent remarks only last week or 2 weeks ago from Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk, and when he told his parliament that Poland would be safer with a nuclear deterrent of its own. So if you're worried about nuclear proliferation, as I think we all should be, a peace of submission where Russia is rewarded for starting a war in Europe is likely to spur other European countries to seek nuclear weapons for themselves. Now, the second argument, which I think is also strong in its way, in an effort to steelman it, is that Russia is simply bigger than Ukraine. It can afford to lose more of its people, its resources, its money in a war of attrition, which is sadly, in many ways, what this war has become. Casualties, deprivation, and censure do not bother Russians, we are told. There are more Russians than Ukrainians, so Russia has the advantage. Well, I don't entirely agree, because one could say the same thing about the Vietnam War, or for that matter, our own Revolutionary War. The size of one country's population and economy is, of course, a factor in assessing the odds of the iron dice of war, but one must also account for the motivations of the sides in the conflict. Ukrainians are fighting for their country's survival. These are existential stakes. What are the Russian conscripts or the North Korean conscripts fighting for? The greater glory of a corrupt tyrant in Moscow? And at what point will the mothers, fathers, and siblings of the dead and wounded Russian soldiers demand an end to their tyrant's war? And sadly, we can't know the answer to that question because there's no real way anymore to gauge public opinion in a country where any criticism of this war is illegal. Russia's jails are filled with Putin's political opponents, the most visible of whom, Alexei Navalny, died in one such prison just last year. But despite this climate of oppression, there's hope at least that Putin's reckless war will face opposition from the families he's demanded so much to fight it. And I would just point out that in the final years of the Soviet Union, another repressive tyranny, there were Russian veterans and their families that brought real pressure on the Kremlin to end another hopeless war in Afghanistan. So we cannot predict a similar reckoning today, but I think it would be foolish to rule out that possibility. Now let's suppose that Ukrainian submission is possible on the Ukrainian side. Let's suppose that Ukraine agrees to be dismembered with no Western security guarantees against a future Russian invasion. Will Russia stop at Ukraine? History teaches that such capitulation only whets the bully's appetite. The implication, of course, is that wars of aggression pay off. Russia, under the Trump plan, would get to keep the territories it conquered, and Ukraine would have to trust Russia not to restart the war when it chose. And that really is the biggest problem with Trump's approach. It relies on the word of Vladimir Putin. Why would any rational person trust a word that Vladimir Putin said? Here is a man who sent his special forces without uniforms to invade Crimea and the Donbass in 2014 and then insisted that no Russian force had arrived in Ukraine for the next 6 months. Here's a man who violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty to such an extent that even our usually risk-averse allies in NATO had to acknowledge that Russia was violating the agreement, knowing that they were paving the way for the first Trump administration to pull out of that agreement. And most important, Russia agreed in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum to respect Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and borders. This was the price of removing Soviet-era nuclear weapons from Ukraine, a good thing for the world. 20 years later, in 2014, Putin proved his country's promises were worthless when he launched his first invasion of Ukraine. So in closing, I want to reiterate that I too would like to see an end to the war. I think we all would. But the terms of its ending matter if Ukrainians are still willing to fight for their survival. Then the prospect of a just and enduring peace is still within reach. Russia's resources are vast, but they are not unlimited. Its military has already taken a beating. With more arms and money, there is a real chance that Ukraine can finally break this death machine that Putin has unleashed upon them. But short of that, at the very least, the decision to compromise and negotiate with Russia should be left to our allies who are doing the fighting. Compelling Ukraine to agree to its subjugation is a sucker's game. For an enduring peace, Russia must be deterred and not rewarded for its reckless aggression.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Eli. At this point, Aaron, go ahead. You have 10 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you to the organizers, Hekmat, Abu Haider, Civil, Young Voices for putting this together. And thank you to everyone who's here in person and watching this at home. In addressing the question before us, it's important to make a distinction between provoked and justified. To argue that Russia's invasion is justified, one has to meet a very high burden that I believe Russia has not met. But when it comes to the issue at hand, whether Russia was provoked, I think there's an overwhelming case that the answer is yes. And this is the question I think should most concern those of us in NATO states, because our governments, I will argue, are behind the provocation and accordingly a major geopolitical disaster that needs to come to an end. The provocation of Russia, in my view, has four main elements: expanding the NATO military alliance to Russia's borders, tearing up vital arms control treaties, installing military assets that threaten Russia's security, and finally, and most fatefully, meddling in countries on Russia's doorstep, primarily Ukraine. Let's start with the most uncontroversial issue, which is NATO expansion. It's now widely accepted that in the talks to end the Cold War, the Soviet Union was promised that NATO, in the words of Secretary of State James Baker, would expand not 1 inch eastward. Now, one could argue, well, too bad, this pledge was never made in writing, and it's true, there was no formal treaty. But then the question becomes, why violate this verbal pledge to not expand NATO, and was it worth it? Well, on the question of why, we know the answer from the US architects of NATO expansion. In October 1994, a Clinton National Security Council memo formally endorsed NATO expansion into Ukraine and other former Soviet countries. The memo argued for expansion on the basis of what it called a, quote, insurance policy, strategic hedge rationale, i.e. neo-containment of Russia. But this goal will be kept in the background only, rarely articulated. In other words, we'll tell the public that NATO expansion is about freedom, self-defense, democracy, and keep our real goal, the neo-containment of Russia, in the background. Now, not everybody was on board. Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot argued that pursuing a, quote, strategy of preemptive containment would be a catastrophic mistake. Our policy would become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is mainly because, Talbot said, quote, the prospect of NATO expansion provokes some of the most basic Russian reflexes to twitch, their fear rooted in geography and history of encirclement and exclusion. Bill Clinton ignored this warning, and as he further enlarged NATO, many other prominent diplomats, including George Kennan, one of the most authoritative diplomats in US history, issued similar pleas that went ignored. Expanding NATO, Kennan wrote, would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Now, when it comes to Ukraine in particular, why would this be such a fateful error? Well, Ukraine is integral to Russia's history and identity. Kyiv is known as the mother of Russian cities. Ukraine and other former Soviet states contain sizable ethnic Russian-speaking minorities. This issue was laid out by George W. Bush's ambassador to Russia, William Burns, most recently the director of the CIA, in a very important 2008 cable. He relayed fears from inside Russia that NATO expansion into Ukraine, quote, could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even, some claim, civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. Given that possibility, Burns predicted, inviting Ukraine into NATO will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Well, just as Bill Clinton did, George W. Bush ignored this high-level and prescient warning. At the 2008 NATO summit in Romania, the Bush administration pushed through a pledge that Ukraine and Georgia will one day join NATO. It's important to stress here that Bush was not just ignoring the advice of veteran diplomats and some of his own advisors like Fiona Hill, but crucially, Ukrainian public opinion. Roderick Lyne, who is the UK's former ambassador to Russia, said this: it was stupid on every level at that time. If you want to start a war with Russia, that's the best way of doing it. Moreover, any poll in Ukraine showed that 2/3 of the Ukrainian public did not want NATO membership, unquote. That longtime Ukrainian public position reflected Ukraine's founding declaration of state sovereignty, which affirmed Ukraine's, quote, intention of becoming a permanently neutral state that does not participate in military blocs, unquote. Well, that pesky problem of Ukraine's founding constitution and Ukrainian public opinion was overcome in 2014 with the ouster of Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, in the Maidan coup. Now here, the standard narrative is that Yanukovych was a Russian puppet ousted by a massive popular movement known as the Maidan because Yanukovych turned away from the European Union and NATO to align closer with Russia. In reality, Yanukovych wanted to maintain ties to both Russia and the West. For this reason, he ruled out Ukraine's entry into NATO while still holding talks about joining the EU in an economic deal. The problem with the EU deal is not that Yanukovych was ordered by Russia to ignore it, but Yanukovych actually read the fine print. And what did it say? That he'd have to embrace harsh austerity measures and curtail ties to Russia, which would have been a disaster in particular for Yanukovych's base in east and southeastern Ukraine. Now, meanwhile, the Maidan coup that overthrew Yanukovych was led not by the peaceful protesters who went out to Maidan, but by powerful and small in number but large in force Ukrainian ultranationalists, including some neo-Nazis, who lacked the support of a majority of Ukrainians, as polls from that time affirm. As two specialists with prominent Western think tanks wrote in Foreign Policy magazine 1 month after Yanukovych was overthrown, the uncomfortable truth is that a sizable portion of Kyiv's current government and the protesters who brought it to power are indeed fascists. Leading the fascist contingent in the Maidan was Ole Tyanibuk of the Svoboda Party. Now, 1 year earlier, the European Parliament had condemned what it called Svoboda's racist, anti-Semitic, and xenophobic views and urged Ukrainian political parties not to associate with, endorse, or form coalitions with this party. Well, one very important party ignored the European Parliament's advice, and that was the US government. Victoria Nuland of the State Department, Senators John McCain and Chris Murphy were among those to fly to the Maidan and cavort around with Tyanibuk and other fascist leaders around the Maidan. McCain and Murphy openly talked about bringing about a transition, and when that transition was finally achieved with Yanukovych's ouster, Murphy took credit. He said that it was our role, in part, that helped lead to this change in regime. What was that role? Well, we know from the infamous intercepted phone call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piet that the US was helping to pick which leaders from the Maidan should join the new government. This reflected the key influence that the US had won by spending millions of dollars via USAID, the NED, and US-friendly billionaires. Accordingly, when the fascist elements of the Maidan sabotaged a power-sharing agreement that had been negotiated by fellow Maidan members that would have left Yanukovych briefly in power, the Obama administration forgot that it had supported the power-sharing agreement and immediately recognized the new coup government that overthrew Yanukovych. What happened after that? The new coup government turned its focus on Ukraine's ethnic Russian population, effectively trying to ban the Russian language and tolerating deadly assaults on ethnic Russians, including in Odessa. In response, Eastern Ukrainians launched an armed rebellion with Moscow's support. The Kremlin, meanwhile, seized Crimea, which hosted its most important naval base. How did the US respond to this? By encouraging more violence. April 2014, John Brennan goes to Kyiv, tells the Ukrainian government, hey, you should launch an operation against the Donbass, we'll back you up. That's exactly what Ukraine did 1 day later. Russia then ramped up its support for the rebels, finally militarily intervening directly in August 2014. This fighting leads to the Minsk Accords, which was premised on Ukraine agreeing to recognize limited autonomy for the Donbass, and the rebels would disarm. Well, again, two powerful constituencies ignored this. Ukraine's ultranationalists, who implemented what the Ukrainian-American journalist Lev Golinkin calls a policy of veto through violence. Every time the Ukrainian government took steps to implement Minsk, the Ukrainian fascists held violent protests. And they were joined in their opposition by powerful US officials. Victoria Nuland privately schemed to undermine Minsk. William Taylor, the top US diplomat in Ukraine at the time, told Volodymyr Zelensky, who had been elected on a platform of peace, that implementing Minsk is, quote, a terrible idea. When Biden took power, Zelensky was encouraged to be more belligerent, culminating in the days before Russia's invasion when Zelensky's government was openly saying, forget Minsk, we're never going to implement it. Now, when Russia invaded, that forced Zelensky into his rejection of Minsk, and you had peace talks, culminating in the Istanbul Accords of April 2022. We know there that there was a deal almost reached. That's because Ukrainians told us that. Alexander Chaly, a senior member of the Ukrainian delegation, said this: "We managed to find a very real compromise." Well, what happened to the compromise? Boris Johnson came over to Kyiv on behalf of the US and told Zelensky that he would not be backed up if he made a peace deal with Russia. Now, on top of sabotaging peace opportunities like the Minsk Accords and the Istanbul Accords, and also expanding NATO to Russia's borders, these dangers have been compounded by the US systematically dismantling arms control treaties, most significantly the ABM Treaty and the INF Treaty. No longer constrained by such agreements, the US has placed advanced weapon systems closer to Russian territory, all while ramping up military exercises, naval activity. Russia tried to address these issues in its December 2021 proposal to the US and NATO, which was effectively rejected. So, in conclusion, by expanding NATO, ignoring the warnings of high-level Western officials, dismantling arms control, meddling in Ukraine's government, building up CIA bases inside of Ukraine, and finally blocking a diplomatic settlement multiple times, the US and NATO have absolutely provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's finally time to put an end to this carnage and embrace the peaceful alternatives that have long been undermined. Thank you.
We'll leave it at there. Thank you. You did go slightly over time. Eli, you'll have an extra minute for your rebuttal. You have 5 + 1, so you have 6 minutes. Please take it away.
Well, so much to respond to there, but I want to start with James Baker himself has said in subsequent interviews with the Washington Post and the New York Times that there was never sort of an agreement, and you're talking about his talks with the Soviets about the reunification of Germany, that there would be no expansion. He said that it came up, but it was never part of any particular agreement, and he said that the US never particularly agreed to it, and it may have been floated at one point, but that's what happens in the course of negotiations. But I want to talk about Maidan because I believe that you've offered a potted history of this particular moment. The reason, which you alluded to, but I think is very important, is that Yanukovych campaigned on this European Union agreement. And he only changed his tune. I mean, you can say that he read the fine print, but he only changed his tune after Putin publicly said that the Ukrainians should not, and that Yanukovych must reject it. And this was something that he acknowledged on Ukrainian television for everyone to see, and Ukrainians were, given their history of subjugation Russian subjugation of Ukraine, furious that their elected leader would kowtow to their hostile neighbor. And that is the spark that lit the flame that led to millions coming out into the streets of Kyiv and other major cities in the revolution of dignity. Now, of course, there is a wide number of actors in Ukraine, but to claim that this was led by fascists or those who were nostalgic for the Nazis or the Azov battalion is to ignore the role of plenty of normal Ukrainians, average Ukrainians, many students, many former students, who simply were horrified at the idea that Vladimir Putin would have so much power over their own country that they could veto a trade agreement that their own pro-Russian president had campaigned on, that people had voted for him for. And that's the real story of Maidan. Now, I'm glad that you acknowledge, Aaron, that the Russians have played a role in the Donbass. That is true. They gave them their weapons. They provided the GRU officers to basically train them. And what did that get us? That got us a shot down Malaysian airliner. Now, the Minsk agreements and the Minsk negotiations, or whoever at the time, that they should pull out and that we have to continue being mean to Russia. The Russians themselves were never interested in fully complying with that, because one of the basic points of the Minsk Accords was that the Russians and these militias would disarm in order to have the elections and local and everything like that. They never did, and they were never really willing to do that. So the idea that Maidan is some sort of provocation and that the Russians, and I mean, let's not gloss over the fact that they simply just seized Crimea and then decided to formally annex it and make it part of Russia. These are the actions of an aggressive country that is seeking to dismember its neighbor. And Putin himself has been obsessed with the history of the Romanov Empire, and he does not believe that Ukraine has a right to exist. Again, he has said this openly. So finally, I just want to say this. It's true that since 2014, the United States has placed advanced weapons and that NATO has had exercises closer and closer to Russia's border. I wonder why. What would have been the event that might have led the United States to try to deter Russia? What could have happened? Oh, it was the first invasion in 2014. So again, I think you have the sequence wrong. The United States has responded to Russia. And as for the expansion of NATO, you're leaving out other things there as well. There was a major effort of the Clinton administration and later the George W. Bush administration to include Russia in the NATO-Russia Council, to be totally transparent, to affirm time and again it's a defensive alliance. There were efforts to try of the concern that the Russians would, there was concern that the Russians may misinterpret, but they said, no, we have no designs on you or anything like that. The recent posture of NATO is a response to Russian aggression, not just in Ukraine, also in Georgia. Now, if you want to say that in 2008 it was a mistake to encourage these countries to apply for NATO membership but never really intend to bring them in, I would agree. But by 2010, Yanukovych had made it very clear that that was no longer on the table for Ukraine. Ukraine only wanted to join NATO after they were invaded, as well they should have.
Thank you, Eli. You have 5 minutes, Aaron, for your rebuttal.
Okay. When it comes to the Minsk Accords, the argument here is that it was Russia and the Russian-backed rebels who should have disarmed first. Minsk had a very clear sequence of events, and the first sequence was predicated on Ukraine starting a dialogue with the rebels and leading to local elections. As I said earlier, every time Ukraine tried to implement that, and Zelensky tried to do this too, he was faced with violent protests from Ukraine's far right. One far-right leader from the group Right Sector said that Zelensky will hang from a tree if he betrays our revolution and tries to implement the Minsk Accords. So that's why Zelensky backed down. Boris Johnson recently gave an interview just this week saying that Zelensky's main problem in implementing Minsk was not Russia, but Ukrainian nationalists. Crimea, yes, Russia annexed Crimea, which was illegal. What is important to point out is two things. According to U.S. government-funded polls, forget Russia's referendum, the vast majority of Crimeans supported this annexation. And Eugene Rumer, who served as a national intelligence officer for Russia under Barack Obama, this is his view about Russia's action in Crimea. Russian actions in Ukraine were entirely logical, perhaps even inevitable, as an extension of Russian threat perceptions. As seen from Moscow, the rapid changes in Ukrainian politics, the collapse of the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, and the coming to power of a political coalition advocating eventual membership in NATO carried with them profound geopolitical consequences for Russia. They signaled the emergence of new threats to Russia's security right at its doorstep, threats that no Russian leader is likely to tolerate without a wholesale change in the country's ideology and understanding of its national security. So I believe that Putin acted just as any Russian leader, no matter where they are on the spectrum, would have acted as well, given Crimea's historical and military importance to Russia. Going back to the the Budapest talks in 1994, because this was important. It's true, Russia made a pledge to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. In exchange, Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. Now, what's often omitted from talk about this is that Ukraine couldn't use those nuclear weapons. The command and control was in Russia. Also, when Russia made that pledge, that was at a time when Ukraine still had in its constitution what I mentioned earlier, a commitment to neutrality. Furthermore, the U.S. also signed that agreement. Can we say that with its meddling in 2014, Victoria Nuland being caught plotting who should lead Ukraine, that the U.S. respected Ukraine's sovereignty? I don't think so. Eli talked about how Clinton administration took steps to respect Russia and include it. Well, the attitude inside the administration was a lot different. William Perry, who was Clinton's defense secretary, he later recounted that the attitude inside the Clinton administration was, who cares what Russia thinks on many issues, NATO expansion and also the expansion of so-called missile defense. Now finally, on this issue of promising NATO to Ukraine and whether it was disingenuous and foolhardy to promise Ukraine something that the U.S. was not intent on actually fulfilling, which is membership to NATO. What I think is important to stress here is that the open door to Ukraine gave the U.S. a back door through which it could fight Russia. So under the guise of this eventual pledge that one day we'll let you in, Ukraine could be further integrated into NATO's military infrastructure. That's why NATO trainers were in Ukraine since 2014. That's why the CIA built up secret bases inside of Ukraine. That's why one former CIA official called Ukraine's military intelligence, quote, our little baby. Under the guise of promising Ukraine a future membership under this open door, the U.S. got a back door through which it could fight Russia without an obligation to actually defend Ukraine if Russia attacked. It was the most cynical of policies, and why did we do it? Biden administration principles made this very clear. Lloyd Austin, Jake Sullivan, what is our goal in Ukraine? Not to defend Ukraine, but to weaken Russia. Joe Biden, what did he say in March 2022 when he was over in Europe? For God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power. The goal from the start was to use Ukraine to not only bleed Russia, but possibly even foment regime change inside Moscow itself. When you have that as the policy, when you have Ukraine being turned into a U.S. proxy, integrated into a hostile military alliance, you cannot be surprised at all if Russia reacts.
All right. Thank you both for your opening statements and your rebuttals. At this point, we'll open the floor for questions and answers. We'll start with both of our debaters. Aaron, Eli, I wonder if you have a question for the other debater, something that they mentioned you want to dig deeper into. Eli, take it away if you have a question for Aaron.
Aaron, when you say that the evidence of this grand cynical strategy to bleed Russia and the integration with NATO, you start in 2014. It's true that the U.S. began some military training in 2014, although Obama notoriously did not agree to sell or provide actual weapons to Ukraine in this period. But don't you think that might have had to do with what had changed in 2014 with the Russian invasion, as opposed to the actions in 2008? Don't you think that maybe the policy changed after Russia invaded its neighbor?
It depends when you start the clock, and I think that the foundational problem here was not only promising NATO to Ukraine, but then helping, I'm not saying orchestrating, but helping, backing a coup. It's pretty clear now that the U.S. backed that coup. That's why, again, when there was a power-sharing agreement that would have left Yanukovych in power, the U.S. said that they supported this publicly. As soon as it was sabotaged, they forgot about that and welcomed the new change in government. Chris Murphy, as I said, took credit for it. There's plenty of more anecdotal evidence. Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, reported that there was high fives around after Yanukovych was overthrown.
But you're acknowledging that there was no stepped-up training and CIA operations before.
No, but
no, I mean that there wasn't. Ukraine's entire defense industrial base was, the U.S. did not really get involved until after 2014.
They got involved, well, first of all, I believe in fomenting the coup, backing it with supporting the opposition.
I'm happy to take that on too.
Television networks propped up out of nowhere that were financed by the U.S. right as the Maidan erupted. This is classic covert stuff. Now, on the day after the coup, the new intelligence chief in Ukraine told the New York Times in the article last year, which reported that there were 12 CIA bases inside of Ukraine built up since 2014. He said that on the day after the coup, his first day on the job, who did he call first? The CIA station chief and his MI6 counterpart. And they established a relationship immediately, cementing Ukraine's new status as a U.S. proxy. That was a threat to Russia, which Russia responded to.
Aaron, do you have a question for Eli?
This is a hypothetical. I mean, if a similar scenario had played out inside Mexico or Canada, where Russia helped back a change of government and then integrate Canada or Mexico into a hostile military alliance, how do you think we would have reacted?
I reject the premise of your question, because I think that what we saw in the Maidan Revolution was people power at work. And as for this notion that there was an actual coup, if you look at the accounts at the time, Yanukovych left and his bodyguards sort of disappeared. There wasn't, he wasn't forced out. There wasn't a military general who pointed a gun at his head and said, "You've got to leave now." He left, and to the shock and surprise of the European negotiators at the time, who were working to basically end a kind of standoff. And also, in your telling of this, I mean, why don't you talk about the fact that there were military snipers shooting at random into a crowd of protesters? That was another escalation on the part of the Yanukovych side of it. So, the vast majority of the violence, there's some violence coming from the other side. It's never 100%, but most of the violence was coming from the pro-Yanukovych forces. So again, I would say that all of these things are kind of reactions to, at first, this sort of situation, which got worse because of the poor handling and the violence that was introduced, after the events in 2013. And then after Russia invades, you see you see it becomes somewhat operational. And again, Obama still refused to formally give weapons to the Ukrainians in that situation. So yeah, I'm sure Ukraine's intelligence chief called the CIA station chief. That happens all the time. As for Toria Nuland and Gregory Pyatt, we have a snippet of a conversation that the Russians bugged and then released to the world. Do you not think that those kinds of conversations are happening all the time with other European diplomats? I mean, I would have loved to have the U.S. use its NSA capabilities on Russian, conversations, and we don't. Ordering the elected president of his neighbor not to take the trade agreement which he had campaigned on and was done after years of negotiation. So you're obsessed with America somehow violating the sovereignty of Ukraine. What about Russia's violations of the sovereignty of Ukraine, which are out in the open for all to see?
Well, again, I think that Russia's primary violation of Ukrainian sovereignty was the invasion, which I do think was an illegal crime. But my argument is that it was provoked. Now, addressing some specific points, Eli mentioned the Maidan massacre, snipers firing down on the crowds. I'll refer you to Ivan Kachanovsky. He's a Ukrainian-Canadian professor, University of Ottawa, written peer-reviewed studies on this. His contention is that the snipers were on the pro-Maidan side. He cites forensic evidence, Ukrainian court records. I'll post some of his evidence online after this. When it comes to Obama, it's true, Obama was very reluctant to do all of this. That was very obvious. In fact, on his way out the door, he argued to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic that if people want to go fight a war on behalf of Ukraine, they should speak up and talk about it. And in fact, it's stupid for us to do that because whatever we do, Russia will always outmatch what we do. So why should we do that? The problem was he was undermined from within by people like Victoria Nuland. At the Munich Security Conference, right as the Minsk two Accords were being brokered, Victoria Nuland had a meeting with people like John McCain, Mike Pompeo, and she basically dismissed the Europeans. She dismissed the Minsk Accords as Angela Merkel's Moscow thing. She was very contemptuous of the Minsk Accords. And by the way, later on, Angela Merkel and Francois Hollande, who helped broker the Minsk Accords, said that it was all a ruse, that it was an effort to stall for time to give Ukraine time to rearm and prepare for a war with Russia. I actually don't believe that Merkel meant that. I think she was just trying to appease pro-war sentiment after Russia invaded. But the fact that they felt that her and Hollande felt compelled to say that speaks to the hostility to diplomacy that exists inside the NATO alliance. And finally, in terms of Nuland's phone call, what business does the U.S. have deciding who should be in and out of government? It reflects that the U.S. had made that the prime minister of the new Ukrainian government, dominated by members of Svoboda. Returning to an earlier point, the new government did not reflect the peaceful protesters, and I agree with you, there are many of them who were liberal-minded, who wanted genuine ties to the West, but that was not what drove ultimately the coup. That was the hardline fascist element that sabotaged their comrades' power-sharing agreement with U.S. backing, and they were the ones who took over under this new coup government.
Okay, can I just ask you, because you mentioned something earlier.
Really quickly, go ahead.
Really quickly. Victoria Nuland, I believe, her hopeless his best to end the war in Syria. How does an undersecretary of political affairs undermine the president? I mean, I'm just saying, do you think that Obama was that incompetent, was that compromised? I mean, walk me through how Toria Nuland managed to create her own foreign policy over the, behind the back and against the wishes of President Obama?
Well, first of all, John Kerry was primarily focused with the Iran nuclear deal, and he basically handed over the Ukraine portfolio to Victoria Nuland, a former aide to both Hillary Clinton and Dick Cheney. And in terms of her influence, well, Foreign Policy reported about the Minsk peace process at the time, after Nuland was on the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference plotting with people like Mike Pompeo and John McCain how to undermine Minsk. Foreign Policy reported this, quote, "The takeaway for many Europeans was that Nuland gave short shrift to their concerns about provoking an escalation with Russia and was confusingly out of sync with Obama." And I believe it was Nuland's influence, because she was very involved behind the scenes. Obama wasn't there, along with Joe Biden, who shared Victoria Nuland's agenda. Biden played an instrumental role here. After all, he was bragging about he had held up a $1 billion loan guarantee to get a prosecutor fired, which speaks to his influence. They were encouraging Ukraine to ignore the Minsk Accords. And this was cemented by the top U.S. diplomat at the time, who I quoted earlier, William Taylor, who recalls that he told Zelensky, forget about the German plan to implement Minsk. It was called the Steinmeier formula. He called it a terrible idea.
All right, thank you both. Folks, start lining up if you have questions. I'll start with my moderator's prerogative. Yeah, you can just line up in the middle, and we'll go one after another, and we will interweave these questions with some of the questions that we're getting online. We have 300 watching on Civil and many more watching on other streams on X and YouTube. So I'll have my moderator's prerogative question, starting with a question for you, Aaron. So bringing this back to the resolution at hand, speaking about the Trump-brokered potential peace agreement, the ceasefire agreement that we are hearing about today. Ukraine is important to us, but more importantly, Russia, a historical nemesis of the United States, specifically before the Cold War and after, has lost. They are on the brink of bankruptcy. They're having to resort to North Korean soldiers to field their trenches, and they have an economy that is similar to Italy's. So why are we now sending them this seemingly lifeline from Trump when they are on the brink of collapse? Why should we do that now? Why is this in our interest as a country?
Well, like Eli did with me, I'm going to reject the premise of your question. I don't think Russia is on the brink of defeat. They're collapsing. They're advancing. They've almost expelled Ukraine from the Kursk region. Yeah, their economy has taken some hits, but it hasn't collapsed in the way that Joe Biden was so giddy about doing. And so they have the advantage now. And therefore, I don't see them accepting a ceasefire unless it leads to a long-term settlement along the lines that they proposed back in late 2021 and along the lines of the Istanbul peace process that the U.S. helped sabotage.
Eli, would you like to comment on the same question?
Well, I mean, we know that it's a brutally repressive climate right now in Russia. So, as I said in my opening remarks, there's no way to know what the Russians really think about this. It's illegal for them to criticize the war. But at a certain point, one would think that the families, the mothers and fathers of the conscripts would be tired of having their children become cannon fodder. Or at least that's the hope. I mean, there are people who know Russia extremely well who would argue that this is what is expected. Every generation there's a great war. That's Russia. It's a different culture. My view is that people would have said the same thing, but we know that there was a significant movement, especially at the end of the Soviet Union, to end the war in Afghanistan. And part of that was driven by the experience that when people would come home from that horrible war, and that eventually it would work. So I don't know. Ultimately is something that I believe that is a bit of a black box. I do think, to be fair, the partnership that Russia has today with China will make it very difficult to accomplish this sort of economic bankruptcy. I do think it's quite possible, though, given the heavy losses and the poorer and poorer quality of soldiers and officers that are going into this meat grinder, that eventually there is a chance, at least, that the Russian army could break, and I think that that would be a great thing for the world.
Thank you both. Question for you, Eli. So considering the position you're taking on this debate, what is your official stance that we should keep arming Ukraine, keep defending them and protecting them supporting them diplomatically until they are able to regain control over the Donbass and maybe even Crimea? what is your outcome that you're proposing here in lieu of this proposed peace treaty that is brokered by Trump?
My position is very simple. I think it's actually a low cost to pay to make sure that Russia is deterred and is not going to be capable and will think twice about continuing Putin's efforts to create a greater Russia of sorts. And that the position of the United States should be that if Zelensky wants to negotiate, then we should support that. But we shouldn't be compelling Zelensky to negotiate a kind of capitulation and submission to Russia, which I really believe is what the Trump plan is. So it is not to say that, that I don't think the United States should sort of be more hawkish than the Ukrainian leader, but I do think that the United States should leave that decision to Zelensky. And that is ultimately, as long as Ukrainians are willing to fight, then I think, and desire to fight for their own survival, then I think we should support them. And I think in the long run, given all of the implications, if Putin believes that he has won, that this gambit works, that is much better for American national interest and also the security of Europe and the world. Because we do not want to have Putin feeling that he is emboldened to continue his adventurism, as it were.
Aaron, you get to comment.
I'll just briefly respond with one quote. There are those in the West who don't mind a long war because it would mean exhausting Russia, even if this means the demise of Ukraine and comes at the cost of Ukrainian lives. This is definitely in the interests of some countries. Who said that? Zelensky, in March 2022, just as his negotiators were reaching a compromise in Istanbul to end the war. And right after that, contrary to Eli's claim that we should be deferential to Ukraine's desires and how they negotiate with Russia, Boris Johnson went to Zelensky and told him, we're not going to back you up with the security guarantees that you need to reach an agreement with Russia and end this war. And we think you should keep fighting him. And when Zelensky complied, he was rewarded with tens of billions of dollars worth of weaponry, which has continued multiple times. Strategically, putting aside the morality of using Ukraine for the interest that Zelensky warned about, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. It's been more than 3 years of this. The Ukrainian death toll, we have no idea what it is, but I would bet it's in the hundreds of thousands. Russia as well. But Russia, as Obama warned about, as Antony Blinken warned about when he was pursuing Obama's policy in 2015, Russia can always outmatch what Ukraine does, given its size and proximity to Ukraine. So we're engaging in not only in a moral strategy, but I believe a futile one.
I mean, Aaron, do you think that Zelensky doesn't want to fight the war, and the only reason he's fighting the war is because he's getting pressure from Europeans?
I think he wanted to end the war in April 2022 when his negotiators brokered a far-reaching agreement with, that was very detailed. I think when he was told by Boris Johnson that he would not be backed up, he made a very fateful choice, and now he has to double down because he walked away from a peace deal that would have ended the war and prevented hundreds of thousands of deaths, and so now he needs something to show for it.
Zelensky and his foreign minister have said that that wasn't a peace deal, and they blame the Russians for it.
Well, I quoted to you one of the top negotiators at that Istanbul process who said that we managed to reach a very real compromise. And
One negotiator. I'm saying Zelensky himself has blamed the Russians for
I can
failing.
quote you others as well. The top negotiator, who's a member of Zelensky's party, said that Russia's main demand was Ukraine being neutral. That's what they wanted.
All right, we're going to move on to the audience questions. Thank you both. Please take it away.
Hi there. This is a question for both of you. So let's say there is a ceasefire. At this point, it looks like the ceasefire will include Russia potentially not getting everything they want. Maybe they won't get Odessa, or they won't get this, or they won't get that. Also, Ukraine not getting everything they want. Maybe they won't get back Donbass or wherever else. In the event that a ceasefire is signed, as much as we all like seeing bloodshed end, what's to guarantee that a couple of years later, when somebody's feeling bold, let's not even say who, which side, but what's to stop the war from just resuming when somebody feels like resuming it?
Thank you.
Well, by that logic, why reach any agreement? Let's just keep fighting until everybody's dead.
I mean, I don't think that Ukraine has designs on Russian territory. I think that Ukraine is fighting for its survival. I mean, it's important to remember that the first sort of special operation action of Putin's war was to send Spetsnaz commandos into Kyiv with the intention of assassinating Zelensky. That is not somebody who just wants to secure a peaceful border. That's somebody who wants to swallow Ukraine. So the question is best put to Russia, and the only way to ensure that Russia does not make another war and violate its word, as it has done so many times in the past, is to make sure that there are real security guarantees, and hopefully to decimate Russia's army and then force it, if it wants another military, to rebuild it over the course of a generation.
Thank you. Let's take. Yeah, please go ahead, but we'll take the next question right after.
On the issue of Putin and his views of Ukrainian sovereignty, before the invasion, he said that we respect Ukraine's sovereignty, but Ukraine's sovereignty is tied to its respect to ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine, which were not being respected following the 2014 coup.
All right, let's take the next question, and please keep them short. We have the finest of New York City's interests, people who have interest in politics and geopolitics. We want to get all these questions in. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. I happen to live in Ukraine for 3 years, originally born and raised in Poland. I speak Russian and Ukrainian. I lived in Russia also for 2 years. Last couple of years I spent in Latin America. I'm saying that just to give you the perspective that I'm getting different sources of information. I have friends on both sides, so the empathy is there. 2 bullet points and 2 questions. First bullet point is there was a prime minister.
One question, please.
Okay, one prime minister from Ukraine, Nikolai Azarov. And in terms of the negotiations with the European Union, he was very clear in the communication, and he said that we put on hold for a while the whole thing. So that's one of the things that I heard on the way. And the other point is that there was also a president of Ukraine, and I speak Ukrainian and Russian. I watched a couple of times the interviews with Dima Gardon, which is a journalist from Ukraine, Russian-speaking journalist from Ukraine, and he said in 2003 and 2008 very clearly, as you said, the nuclear missiles, they were in control of Russians, and going beyond that, they didn't have money to maintain the whole weapons. So that's why they signed the Budapest treatment.
All right, we'll have to.
A question.
Yeah, quickly,
right now,
very quickly.
Yeah,
Thank
quick question. So just bullet points, just to. Don't you feel that whatever is happening right now in Ukraine is actually an attempt to break Russia, weaken Russia, in order to break the alliance between Russia and China before the economic war between the U.S. and China? Thank you.
All right, please take it away, folks. I think, Aaron, you'd like to start commenting on the. Oh, no, Eli, please go ahead.
I think that there are many in the Trump administration who believe that capitulating to Putin will be a way of enticing Russia to break its alliance with China. I don't think that will have much of an effect. I think fighting for, supporting Ukraine's existential struggle to survive is a way of trying to curb Russian aggression. I think in some ways, we'll see what happens between Russia and China. Russia is a junior partner, and it has a very grand understanding of its historical place in the world. So we'll see if that lasts. But I don't know that there's much America can do diplomatically or militarily or anything at this point to break that alliance.
I want to address the point about the EU deal that Yanukovych was talking about signing back in 2014. At the time, Putin said that that Russia was not opposed in principle to a Ukrainian EU deal. They just said if it comes at the cost of excluding Russia, there's going to be a very heavy cost. We're going to have to retaliate. And that's why if you read the Istanbul Accords, the draft of which was published by the New York Times last year, they say that Ukraine's free to join the European Union, which I think exposes the lie that Russia has tried to sabotage Ukraine's entry into the European Union. They've tried to undermine it if it's on terms that cut off Russia and also facilitate Ukraine's entry into NATO.
Let's take the next question.
For me, adjudicating whether the historical background paints Russia as a rational responder versus an unprovoked aggressor, it misses the point. And the question is whether Trump is justified in promoting a peace treaty. And from this perspective of the type of person that Trump is representing, a self-interested American, why does it matter that Ukraine is Russian or not?
Because it's not, Russia won't stop at Ukraine. Russia would like to, what they call, control its sphere of influence. The victory in the Cold War was very much linked to the idea that what we used to call captive nations would be free to make their own decisions. And the history matters because since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moscow has, with a brief exception for most of the 90s, tried to exert its influence and undermine the sovereignty of the countries that were once compelled to be part of that union run by Moscow. So the answer is the United States supports the idea that Ukraine should be independent and Belarus should be independent and Estonia should be independent and Georgia should be independent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is Russia that would like to reconstitute that empire. And given the long-standing hostilities that the Kremlin has towards the United States, if it is allowed to complete this project, then all we have done is allowed an adversary to grow stronger.
On the issue of a sphere of influence, in denying that to Russia, we don't apply the same standard to ourselves. That's why we constantly meddle in Latin America, most recently, and still continuing an effort to overthrow Venezuela's government. On the issue of whether or not, whether or not Russia would stop at Ukraine, I tried to argue in my opening remarks that Ukraine has special significance to Russia, given history. Kiev, again, is known as the mother of Russian cities, and there are millions of ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine. Ukraine is a very special case. That's why when other former Soviet states have been expanded, brought into NATO, Russia did not react this harshly. Let me quote E. Wayne Mary, the chief political analyst at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, 1994. The key issue for stability within the former Soviet domain is the status and well-being of the 25 million ethnic Russians beyond the borders of the Federation. The key country is Ukraine, home to about half of them. So there's no reason to believe that Russia would carry out in other countries what it has carried out in Ukraine, given Ukraine's special significance. And by the way, in 3 years of war, they've only managed to take 20% of Ukraine's territory. How could they possibly try the same thing somewhere else, even if they wanted to?
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. My name's Kine, and I do work with the Schiller Institute. My question was to both of you. We're seeing kind of a rampant mobilization now on the part of Europe and the British to throw billions of euros to keep this war going in Ukraine. And at the same time, we see these industries there are crumbling. You know, they're not able to maintain stable economies. Trump is now pulling out. He said we spent over $350 billion on this war, which I'm not sure how accurate that figure is, but we certainly spend billions. And it seems like the military situation is completely lost. As you mentioned, Aaron, Russians are close to getting rid of the Ukrainians now in Kursk. So with this situation lost, why throw billions at this conflict when you can instead actually make peace and come to a resolution that would benefit both sides and stop this killing? That's my question.
Well, yeah, you can, as I said in my opening remarks, you can have peace tomorrow. All Zelensky needs to do is get down on his knees. There's a principle at stake here, and it's not about particular pieces of territory. I really believe the stakes are for Ukraine itself. And if the United States ends its supply of weaponry, especially in this sort of dramatic and in such a quick way, without the Europeans being able to invest over a period of a few years at least to build up its military industrial base again, so that perhaps it could supply, because it's certainly in Europe's interest to try to stop Putin as well as I believe ours, well then you're basically just telling Ukraine it should surrender. And I think you will only whet the appetite of the bully. Now, and I also think you will have a massive nuclear proliferation problem, because the one thing that countries like Poland are now starting to talk about, and other countries to talk about, is that they want a deterrent, and that deterrent will be nuclear weapons, and that will be a disastrous kind of situation. We've been very lucky that there are only a handful of nuclear powers right now. If you let Putin win in the name of peace, then I believe that we will have massive amounts of proliferation and also an emboldened, aggressive, revisionist power in Russia.
To answer this, I'd only repeat myself, I think, so we can go to the next question.
Hi, this question is mainly to you, Eli, but I'd like Aaron to respond as well. I want to push back on a lot of this rhetoric, a lot of this talk you have of Putin wants to reconstitute the former Soviet Union and so on and so forth.
The Romanov Empire.
Romanov, okay, the Romanov Empire. according to John Mearsheimer, right, a political scientist from...
I'm aware of who he is.
Okay, well, a lot of people might not be aware of who he is. When Russia, the recent escalation into Ukraine in 2022, he went in with somewhere between 175,000 and 190,000 troops. Now, does that sound, well, I'll put it this way, and this is also coming from Mearsheimer. When Hitler went into Poland, a country much smaller than Ukraine, he went in with 1.5 million troops. That's how many troops it takes to take over Poland. Now, Ukraine, a country much bigger than Poland, going in with at most 190,000 troops, to me does not sound like the intention is to occupy, take over, consume the country. To me, it sounds like you want to make the country, you want to say, hey, stop the meddling, the NATO expansion. We're not going to allow this on this border. And I'd like you to respond how that can be.
Okay, well, I want to say a couple things. First of all, John Mearsheimer said that in, I believe it was 2013 or 2014, no, it was 2014 after the Russians snatched Crimea and parts of Donbass, that Russia would never try a full invasion of Ukraine because he understands that Ukraine is like a porcupine. Well, that wasn't a great prediction on his part, but here's why I say Russia intended to swallow Ukraine. First of all, the Spetsnaz operation to try to assassinate Zelensky in the opening days of the war itself. So that is obviously going after the leader. And second of all, everybody believed that after Putin gave his psychotic speech in which he offered this bizarre history of how Ukraine's not a real country, and that's the sort of thing you would say if you didn't believe that it had a right to be a sovereign state. And finally, it wasn't just me saying it as an analyst here in New York City tonight. At the time, if you remember, Biden offered a helicopter to Zelensky to get out of Kyiv because he believed that he would face the same fate as the Afghan government that toppled to the Taliban. And what was Zelensky's? Don't send me a helicopter, send me ammunition. So at the time, there was a very real threat. And the reason why you would have smaller numbers and so forth, I mean, it's an interesting point, but it's also, warfare is different these days, and I think he underestimated what the Ukrainians were willing to fight for. He believed.
Let him finish. And you've asked your question.
He believed that the Ukrainians didn't want to be Ukrainian. He believed that. He said they will welcome us as liberators. This is one of the. So he was under the illusion that he was going for the entire country at the time. And the fact that he was stopped, and the fact that his troops were not well supplied, and the fact that and by the way, he's thrown so many more at this. So if this was just a way of sort of saying, don't screw around with NATO, we want you to be a neutral country, then why would he continue to throw hundreds of thousands of conscripts into this meat grinder? It's obviously that he's after something else, and I think we all know. And by the way, we can also look at his behavior in other countries. He also likes frozen conflicts, I would say. So he's going to push as far as he can get at this point. But again, I would point to the Spetsnaz operation, the fact that he, before the war, gave a speech that basically said that Ukraine was a fake country, and then the reaction from all these global leaders that believed that Zelensky and his government were in peril, and because of the Russian invasion.
Thank you. Go ahead, Aaron.
Before the war, again, Putin made the point that Russia respecting Ukraine's sovereignty is intertwined with Ukraine's respect for the millions of them, ethnic Russians inside of Ukraine. And he got a lot of controversy when he said that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Well, Zelensky said the exact same thing. Zelensky said, before the Russian invasion, Russia and Ukraine are brotherly people. We are one color, one blood. That reflects the historical, familial, cultural ties between Ukraine and Russia. So I don't think what Putin said is that controversial, given that Zelensky echoed similar statements. In terms of the size of the force that invaded Ukraine in February 2022, I agree, although I'm not a military expert, it was not sufficient to take over all of Ukraine. I do believe that Putin did not expect the resistance that he faced. I think he did expect Ukraine's government to collapse. But when that failed, immediately, literally 2 or 3 days after the invasion, you had peace talks begin between Ukraine and Russia, culminating in the Istanbul Accords. That, to me, is not the action of someone who wants to take over all of Ukraine. It's someone who is, I think, with a lot of hubris, thinking that Ukraine would collapse When that failed, immediately returned to trying to impose at gunpoint the diplomacy that Ukraine had rejected prior to the invasion.
All right, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Kayla Popachet, and I'm from the American Communist Party. My question is, why is it that when there is a single American in need, should we, as the American state, be involved in any country at all, any foreign aid, when there's a single American going hungry?
Well, we're a big country and a global power, and our global power helped rid Europe of the Nazis, and our competition also helped, I'm sorry for you, the Soviet Union, your team, but, you know, America is a great power. It represents certain things, and it's a shame if people go hungry in America, but there are far fewer people in America per capita going hungry than in many other places in the world. We are a land of great abundance. And of course, I believe that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I appreciate your question and look forward to chatting after the show.
Aaron, would you like to comment on that? Or go ahead.
I completely reject what you just said because we are not the global policeman. Okay, George Washington in his farewell address warned us against foreign entanglements. We should never be involved in any wars, and you've got this crazy idea of containment.
Please, let's just go to the question.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
I should be, yeah. Basically, my question is, if all of these independent states require American taxpayer dollars, are they truly independent, Eli?
Well, I believe I'm an American exceptionalist, full disclosure. So I think that we have a different kind of alliance system than really any great power in world history, in that we don't compel independent countries to join our alliance. They seek to join our alliance. And then we see that just in this entire NATO debate. The reason why so many countries join NATO is because the people in those countries wanted to join NATO. And I think that that's a good thing. I think our allies give us an ability to project power in lots of different ways. So I hear you that it's costing the taxpayer money. I don't think it's particularly burdensome given the fact that we have such a robust and large economy, and I think that we get something out of it. We get, for the most part, a pretty stable, at least maybe until now, economic trade system. We, haven't had lots of problems with piracy. We've been able to sell our goods on markets all over the world, and that's good for us. So, I mean, I see your point, but I think you got to look at the bigger chessboard.
On the point about populations desiring to join NATO, as I pointed out before, the former UK ambassador to Russia pointed out that when NATO was promised to Ukraine in 2008, 2/3 of the population opposed it, in line with Ukraine's declaration of state sovereignty. Many more polls after that reflected similar numbers. So Ukraine's desire to join NATO, I argue, was imposed with a coup, not because of popular opinion. On this, and the polls now exclude the breakaway republics of the Donbass.
I would imagine most Ukrainians would love to be in NATO.
Well, certainly after you're attacked and all their alternatives are blocked, yes, you can understand why. But again, our role has been in blocking the peaceful alternatives that could have avoided all the carnage that now makes some Ukrainians, or more of them, want to join NATO.
All right, let's keep these questions brief because we're running out of time, and we remind those watching online, submit any questions. We'll try and factor them into the closing statements. Okay. Please go ahead.
Be very quick. Just about foreign entanglements, I'm glad the French didn't think like that in the 1700s. But my question for you guys is, for both of you, is what does peace actually look like? A negotiated, realistic peace that's not going to extremes of somebody bending the knee, but something that can be negotiated. I don't think that Luhansk, Donetsk, Donbass, like Ukraine is not getting those territories back, no matter how many F-16s, American HIMARS, or Bradleys that we send there. How does this actually look, given Russia's historical insecurity for the geographics that they have in the Eastern Steppe, and their current insecurities when it comes to their declining demographics, the decline of brain power in their military-industrial complex? Let's leave the question there.
All right, go ahead.
I got it.
Aaron or Eli?
I don't know what percentage of people in these regions want to be a part of the new Russia. I know that in Crimea, if you read U.S. government-funded polls, it's overwhelming. Most Crimeans want to be a part of Russia. In Donetsk, Luhansk, I don't know. What I do know is that there is a sizable contingent that want to be a part of Russia. And back in the time of the Istanbul Accords, the Minsk Accords, a reasonable solution would have been having a referendum, having the people vote on it. That's gone now because Ukraine walked away from the Istanbul Accords and the Minsk Accords. So the just outcome is never going to be achieved. The realistic outcome, I think, is Russia taking at least Donetsk and Luhansk, and we'll see if they also hold on to their claims to Zaporizhia and Kherson.
Thank you. Let's take another one. Or Eli, would you like to also comment?
I would just say I think a just peace would be to have elections in those regions without, not under the threat of Russian guns or militias affiliated with Russian guns. And I'm a democracy guy. If they vote without the compulsion of the Russian military or fears that their family will be shot, and they want to join Russia or they want to be independent, then that happens. But we can't do that, and we haven't been able to do that for the last 11 years because Russia, through its proxies and so forth, have basically used its militias to occupy those regions. So, I mean, I don't think we're capable of having such an election, but that would be one component of peace, and the other would be serious kinds of security guarantees. And hopefully, Ukraine having a strong enough military that it would be able to deter the Russians from ever doing it again, and hopefully a broken Russian military. We'll see.
And I'll just say that when it comes to respecting democracy, Ukrainians voted for Yanukovych, and when he was overthrown, we did not respect their democracy then. A very
He
fateful
left
mistake.
voluntarily, but okay.
Under the threat of violence and the
Not
sabotage
under the
of
threat of
Paris.
violence, he left.
I can quote you.
He was in the middle of negotiations.
Yeah, under the threat of violence from the fascist elements of the Maidan. I can share quotes with it.
All right. No responses, please. We'll go ahead for another question. Thank you, though. All right.
Hello, I am Shelley Farce. I'm also from the American Communist Party, and this is for Eli Lake. You claim that Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty, democracy,
Yes.
and peace. How can you call it a democracy when there is video recorded evidence of the Ukrainian government kidnapping average Ukrainian citizens, including senior citizens, into serving the Ukrainian army?
Okay, well, it's true that there is conscription in a war for its life. And just because I defend Ukraine's right to exist doesn't mean I have to defend everything that the government is doing. But there is a war. You can't have an election when you have 6 million Ukrainians that do. Ukrainian sovereignty or independence, I would, put your questions to Mother Russia.
All right. I think we'll take the other questions all in a row, and then hopefully Eli and Aaron, you'd address them in your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. So for you, would you apply the same logic regarding like wanting peace or finding a peaceful solution to a person breaking into your house, starting to shoot at you, you return fire, and then, people start to tell you from the outside, oh, you should reach a just solution, you should try and find peace, when there's no guarantee this person won't break into your house again in 5 years? The answer you gave to this question before was, well, then why not just kill everybody? But the threat for Russia is not existential. For Ukraine it is. For Ukrainians it is an existential demise for them, for the demise of their country and their sovereignty. I think it's very different. They are willing to die for that cause.
All right, you've asked your question. Thank you. Please, next.
Do I answer or no?
Just keep those in the back of your mind. Maybe take some notes and hopefully address them in your closing statements. Let's take another question.
Thank you. Earlier, you referenced the Maidan Revolution and suggested that the U.S.'s influence campaign within the Ukraine may have been, or we might have started there. I'm not sure if either of you are so familiar with the Orange Revolution, but there is an oligarch named Olav something who highlights Ukrainians not relying on the propaganda media anymore, but being on Facebook. I just think in a post-Arab Spring world, it's worth squaring the question when we ask if this was unprovoked, whether we're divorcing neighbors.
All right, thank you. And the last question.
Okay. Nobody seems to have paid attention to what's going on in Europe. Recently, 80% of French thinks that the United States is the biggest threat geopolitically. The French was demanding the U.S. return the Statue of Liberty. The British thinks the United Nations shouldn't be headquartered in New York anymore. Anyway, so what's going on between Trump and Putin is making the Europeans feeling very largely marginalized. They are waking up to defend themselves. So my question is, do you think NATO will be dead, and if so, when? And second part of this is the relation between U.S. and EU and the Europeans. Will they split apart after this? Is this a dividing historical moment?
All right, thank you very much. Thank you all for the questions, and thanks for the 500 or more who are watching currently online. We truly appreciate it. At this point, hopefully you have taken some mental notes and you are ready to address some of these questions that were posed. Eli, you have 5 minutes for your closing remarks, and then Aaron.
Are we answering the questions, or?
No. In your 5 minutes for the closing remarks, just because we're running short on time, address some of the questions. If you can, if you'd like, just let them go.
Okay, I have to acknowledge that I did not fully understand the question about Facebook and the Arab Spring. I believe that the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity in Maidan and the Rose Revolution in Tbilisi in Georgia and these people power movements are a direct descendant of the people power movements that we saw with Solidarity, in my t-shirt here, in Poland, and the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia at the time. And that this is the world becoming freer, and that the ultimate threat that Putin really is responding to, it's not NATO, it's not a trade agreement with the European Union, it's not the National Endowment for Democracy or Toria Nuland. His nightmare is that there will be freedom and prosperity for his neighbors, and that Russians may look around and say, why not us? And so that is what he is interested in. And these wars of conquest are ultimately a strategy for Putin to make sure that he never has to face such a reckoning. Now, I am an American, as I think most of us here are, and I think it is in our nation's DNA that even if we do not and we cannot have the ability to support every movement for independence and freedom and democracy, we should be in solidarity with that, because it's who we are. It has been the symbol of what our nation has stood for since our founding. And whether we like it or not, the world will look to our example for this. And we haven't always been perfect, and we haven't always supported Democrats, and we've certainly supported in the Cold War plenty of dictators. But at the bottom line is that what Putin is fundamentally interested in is to make sure that none of his neighbors ever experience the kind of freedoms that we take so for granted in our country. And that is my closing remark.
First, addressing some of the questions, there was a question about if someone breaks into your house, would you then immediately try to negotiate an agreement with them, even with the threat that they would do it again? That again depends when you start the clock. When it comes to Ukraine and Russia, I don't start the clock when Russia broke into Ukraine's house. I started with the NATO expansion, arms control, dismantling, the coup in 2014, the proxy war that ensued afterward. And on the issue of this being existential for Ukraine, that's true. But I think what is missing here, and Russia's done a terrible job at promoting this issue is also existential for millions of ethnic Russians in the Donbass who revolted against a government that was installed against their will in 2014. They had voted for Yanukovych. The East and Southeast was his base, and that's where you saw Russia-backed rebellions. Some people want to say this is all just a Russian action, but I think you look at the available evidence, this was a genuine grassroots rebellion supported by Russia, certainly. They couldn't have maintained without the support of Russia, but there was grassroots support. On the question of whether NATO will be dead or not, I don't make predictions. I have no idea. What I do know is that this war is horrific. It didn't need to happen. I've traced this to decisions made in the West to, rather than respect Ukraine's divisions, there's a large part of Ukraine that hates Russia, wants nothing to do with it. There's also a sizable part concentrated in the Donbass and Crimea that considers themselves to be ethnic Russians. In that situation, it is crazy, it is lunacy to try to push the country into one camp. The answer has always been what Ukraine had in its foundational declaration of state sovereignty, being neutral, and that's what Yanukovych tried to enshrine before he was overthrown. Rather than respecting Ukraine's divisions, we tried to push it into one camp for our own ends, and I think that's been a disaster. And the more honest U.S. officials, whether it's Lloyd Austin, Jake Sullivan, Mitch McConnell, many others, have bragged about what a great investment this is, not because we're defending Ukraine, but because we're bleeding Russia without a single person being, without a single U.S. soldier being killed. Why are we invested in killing Russians? Why are we invested in destroying Russia's economy? Did U.S. voters vote for that? Did Joe Biden campaign on that? No, this is a project of a very influential circle of policymakers in Washington from both parties who are driven by hegemony. And because Russia is a deterrent to U.S. hegemony, that's why they have pursued this insane policy. It's time for it to come to an end.
All right, thank you both. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Aaron, for an excellent debate. Everyone now, we invite you to once again whip out your phones, scan the QR code for the post-debate poll. Let's see if your opinions have been swayed by any of the arguments that were made today. As you do so, Casey, the CEO of Young Voices, will make some remarks. Please take it away, Casey. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As usual, I want to give just a short little pitch about Young Voices for those of you who have not heard of us. Young Voices is a nonprofit talent agency. We help libertarian and conservative writers age 18 to 35 get their start in media, because it's really tough for a young person to develop a name for themselves and kind of a brand and expertise. And Young Voices helps people kind of kickstart their career by getting their first op-eds placed, getting them onto radio and TV, doing public speaking like at events like this, and all that good stuff. So if you are in that category, 18 to 35, looking to build a career in the world of ideas, please check us out. We are always looking for new applicants. Our URL is joinyv.org. I'll also be sticking around afterwards at the reception. And of course, we're always looking for partners, donors, potential ideas for future debates. So would love to chat with you afterwards. I also want to give a quick shout out. Of course, it was great for Gene to mention upcoming Soho Forum debates. I want to mention that another close partner organization of ours, the Reason, is throwing an event tomorrow night, actually at this very same space. So I hope you'll check it out. It's the Reason Speakeasy, Lee Stein and Julius Toronto. I'll read the description. Is satire possible anymore in a world that outstrips our imagination on a daily or maybe even hourly basis? That's the topic of the next Reason Speakeasy, a monthly unscripted conversation with outspoken defenders of free thinking and heterodoxy in an age of intellectual conformity and groupthink. So yeah, hope to see you tomorrow night for those of you that are free, and we're very grateful to have Nick here as well. Great. Are we ready for the results?
I'll give them one last minute. Please, as you do so, if any stragglers, I know Nick was still voting last time when we opened the pre-debate vote. So, all right, we got a thumbs up. Please take a moment, follow us on X, civil.com, myself at What the Heckmat, and Young Voices at Join Young Voices to know about future debates and other opportunities to engage with intellectual ideas that are libertarian and pressing in today's political moment. All right, with that said, I now have the results for our debate right here. All right, so we started off with the agree side, Eli's side, with 24.6% of the audience being on your side. You concluded the debate with 31% on your side, gaining 6.41% of the vote. Congratulations, Eli, you gained some portion of the vote. The disagree, which is on the opposition side, you started with 54% of the vote, and you ended with 66% of the vote, thus winning the debate because you got a change of 12%. Congratulations, Aaron, on winning the debate. With that, that concludes our evening, folks. Thank you very much for attending. We had a maxed out room, 125 of you, and we have 500 and more watching online. So it's been a pleasure to host you in New York City live here, and we hope to see you in here soon for another debate in the future.